They refused to help him because his ID was outdated, until a retired general walked in and told them exactly who they were turning away. Walter Jenkins pushed the glass door open with the side of his cane, stepping slowly into the cool interior of the First Pacific Bank on J Street in Sacramento. The floor tiles gleamed too much. Everything inside felt new, cold even. He paused for a second to catch his breath. The trip from his apartment, just 4 blocks away, had taken him longer than usual. His right knee throbbed with every step, a leftover gift from his days fixing tanks in the thick muck of Vietnam. He wore his old army cap, the one with the faded 1st Cavalry Division patch barely hanging on by the threads. His flannel shirt was tucked into worn jeans held up by a belt that had lost its original color. In his breast pocket, folded carefully, was a check for $85. Money his daughter sent every month to help cover groceries. She lived in Idaho now, had 2 kids of her own. Good kids. Busy. But she always remembered to send the check. Walter made his way to the shortest line and waited behind a middle-aged man tapping loudly on his phone screen. The bank was quiet. People were either scrolling or staring at the floor. The kind of place where no one smiled unless they had to. When it was finally his turn, he stepped forward, smiling at the young teller behind the counter. She had a tight bun, long acrylic nails, and a look in her eye that said she was already annoyed. "Hi there," Walter said, his voice a little raspy but kind. "Just here to cash a check." She glanced at the check, then looked back at him. "ID, please." "Sure," he said, reaching into his back pocket. He pulled out an old leather wallet and carefully slid out a laminated ID card. It was a California driver's license that expired 5 years ago. The corner was chipped. His photo was from another time, back when he still had more hair and a straighter posture. The teller barely looked at it. "This is expired." "I know," he said. "I don't drive anymore, so I never renewed it. But I've been cashing checks here for a while. Same account, same bank. I've got my VA card, too, if that helps." She sighed and motioned to the side. "Hang on a sec." She walked over to another counter where a man in a slim grey suit stood watching the floor like it owed him money. She said something quietly, showed him the ID, and pointed back at Walter. The man barely glanced up before shaking his head. The teller returned. "I'm sorry, sir. We can't cash your check without a valid government-issued ID." Walter blinked. "Miss, I've been coming here for years. I opened my first account with this bank when Reagan was president. I've got checks with my name. I've got the VA card. I've got this cane, for heaven's sake. I didn't buy that as a prop." "It's not about that," she said, clearly annoyed now. "It's policy." Walter paused, then quietly said, "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just need this cashed. I need groceries." Another man behind him sighed loudly. The line had grown longer. One woman glanced over at Walter, then quickly looked away. A teenager in a hoodie took a step back, like this was about to get messy. "I understand," Walter said, voice softer now. "But there's got to be something you can do. I already asked my manager," she said, pointing to the man in the suit. He said no. Walter looked over. The manager didn't meet his eyes, just stood with arms folded, checking his watch. Walter let out a breath and stepped aside. His shoulders slumped just a little. He gripped his cane tighter. He wasn't angry, just tired. There was a difference. But the thing that got to him most wasn't the refusal. It was how nobody looked at him. Like he wasn't there. Like he hadn't built engines in a jungle halfway across the world to keep other men alive. Like he hadn't earned anything at all. But then, just as he turned to leave, the door behind him opened, and someone walked in who remembered exactly who Walter Jenkins was. General Robert Langston hadn't meant to stop at the bank that day. He was on his way to a lunch meeting with a city councilman, some veterans' housing initiative that had stalled in committee for months. He figured he'd swing by to deposit a check, grab a coffee, and maybe walk through Capitol Park to clear his head before another round of red tape. But as soon as he stepped inside the First Pacific Bank and caught sight of Walter Jenkins standing near the counter, head slightly bowed, cane planted like a third leg, he knew this detour wasn't an accident. Langston recognized that back, that profile, the tilt of the shoulder from an old injury, the way Walter stood like he was always half on guard, even now, but Walter didn't see him. He was focused on the same teller who now leaned toward another customer, chatting and laughing like nothing had happened. Walter hadn't moved yet. He stood there like someone unsure of what to do next, like a guest in a house that used to be his but no longer felt like home. Langston waited, watching for a moment. The air felt stale. No one spoke to Walter. No one acknowledged him. Even the manager, who clearly had the authority to do something, was already walking toward his office, tapping on his phone. Langston walked forward slowly. "Walter?" The old mechanic turned, blinking. "Sir? It's Robert Langston," he said, stepping closer. "You worked on my convoy near Cam Bay. Saved our rear ends when that axle locked up outside Long Bin. You remember?" Walter's face cracked into something between a smile and disbelief. "I'll be damned. You still alive?" Langston chuckled. "Barely." But still standing, they shook hands. Walter's grip still strong. And the moment held. Two men with decades between their last meeting and this one, tied together by memories soaked in heat, oil, and gunpowder. "What happened?" Langston asked, gesturing to the check still in Walter's hand. "Ah," Walter said, brushing it off. "Just a little policy thing. They won't cash the check without a valid ID. Mine's expired. I told them I got my VA card, account info, everything. But the teller said no. Manager didn't even look at me." Langston's smile faded. "Is that right?" Walter nodded. "It's all right. I can come back some other time, maybe with my daughter on the phone. Or not, I've still got a few cans left at home." Langston turned toward the counter. The teller looked up as he approached. She didn't recognize him, not yet. Just saw another man in a sport coat. Another complaint coming. "Can I help you, sir?" she said. "Yes," Langston said. "You can help that man right there. His name is Walter Jenkins, Vietnam vet. Fought under my command. You just denied him service over an expired ID?" The teller glanced at Walter, then back at Langston. "Sir, it's just policy. We can't cash checks without—" "I don't need the speech," Langston interrupted. "What I need is for someone here to explain why a man who wore the uniform and risked his life for this country is being treated like he's invisible." "Again, sir," she said, shifting slightly. "We're just following protocol." "Do you know what protocol is?" Langston asked, his voice still level. "It's a rule someone wrote, often without thinking about people like Walter. You don't ignore context. That's what separates human beings from a vending machine." The manager had stepped out of his office now, clearly sensing something was off. He walked over, fixing his blazer. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked Langston. Langston didn't turn right away. He looked at Walter first. Then he faced the manager. "I was asking why this man," he said, gesturing, "who fixed armored vehicles in hostile territory under mortar fire, is standing here being treated like a fraud." "I understand your concern," the manager said carefully. "But unfortunately, we have to comply with identification policies for all transactions." "Don't start with unfortunately," Langston said. "There's nothing unfortunate about a rule. What's unfortunate is the way you applied it. Without care, without discretion, without respect." The manager opened his mouth but said nothing. Langston stepped a little closer. His voice stayed calm. "You ever been shot at? Ever pulled a wrench out of your own thigh because there was no one else? Ever slept in mud with one eye open while the sky lit up around you? Walter has. You think a piece of plastic with an expiration date tells you more about who he is than that?" The room was completely still. Even the guy who had been annoyed behind Walter earlier now looked uncomfortable. But silence doesn't fix anything, not until someone decides to break it the right way. Walter didn't say a word while Langston spoke. He just stood there, a little stunned, the check still folded in his hand. He wasn't used to anyone speaking for him, hadn't been for a long time. These days, he mostly kept to himself. Bought his groceries on Thursdays, called his daughter every other Sunday, and sat on the small balcony of his apartment with the old radio turned to talk shows that made him feel less alone. But now, here was the general, his general, standing up for him, out of nowhere, like no time had passed. It sent Walter somewhere he hadn't been in decades. The bank faded. The fluorescent lights, the buzz of murmured voices, the stiff tension in the air. It all dimmed. Suddenly he was back in 69. The jungle was thick and wet with steam. The roar of Hueys cutting the sky, dirt under his fingernails, grease on his arms, the engine of a supply truck in pieces on a makeshift tarp. Shells in the distance, real ones, not memories. He was 27. Sweat poured down his face, but his hands didn't shake. He didn't have time for fear. The convoy had stalled. If the engine didn't turn over in the next few minutes, they'd all be sitting ducks. So he tightened a bolt with one hand and pressed gauze to a friend's bleeding leg with the other. The general, Langston, then just a colonel, had crouched beside him, firing a rifle and shouting to cover the team. Walter had gotten the engine running with a part scavenged from a blown-out radio. It wasn't supposed to work, but it did. That wasn't even the worst of it. He'd been in worse places, knee-deep in water with leeches crawling into his boots, climbing into half-crushed Humvees to pull out bodies, wrapping wires with one hand while the other held a flashlight between his teeth. He never talked about that. Not to his daughter, not to anyone. Not because he was ashamed. Just because... who would understand? But the general did. He'd seen it. He remembered. And now, decades later, they were standing in a spotless bank surrounded by people who didn't know any of it. Didn't care. Saw Walter as an old man, slow and outdated. "I'm sorry," Walter said softly, almost without meaning to. Langston turned to him. "For what?" "I don't want to cause a mess," Walter replied. "I've gotten by just fine. They got their rules." "No, Walter," Langston said, his voice gentler now. "You're not causing a mess. You're reminding people how easily they forget." The manager looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. A woman further back in line cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said, stepping forward slightly. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but that man was in the service?" Langston looked her in the eye. "He was the reason a dozen of us made it back. That's not an exaggeration." She looked at Walter with new eyes. "Thank you," she said. Walter nodded, almost bashfully. "You're welcome, Mom." The teller still stood frozen, unsure what to do. She glanced at the manager, waiting for a signal, but the manager seemed stuck between embarrassment and regret. He looked at the check in Walter's hand and then at the teller. "Cash it," he muttered. "Now." The teller moved quickly, suddenly focused. She took the check with careful hands, like it might crumble under pressure. Langston stepped back slightly, letting the space between them breathe. "You should never have had to explain yourself, Walter. Not here. Not anywhere." Walter gave a little chuckle. "It's all right. I'm used to it. Been invisible for a long time. No one should get used to that," Langston said. The woman who had thanked Walter earlier looked around at the rest of the customers. No one else said anything, but several of them looked guilty now. They hadn't spoken up. They hadn't even looked up. And that silence, it lingered. But Langston wasn't going to let the lesson end with just a transaction. There was more to say, and everyone in that room needed to hear it. Langston didn't like using his rank for personal matters. It made him uncomfortable. He'd worked his entire career to teach younger soldiers how to lead without flashing titles. But there were moments, rare ones, when silence cut too deep and names carried weight for a reason. This was one of them. As the teller returned from the back office with Walter's freshly counted bills, Langston stood quietly, scanning the room. No applause, no gasps, just shifting feet and downcast eyes. Not because of guilt, exactly, but because they'd just realized they'd been in the presence of someone who mattered and didn't act like it. Walter didn't rush to take the money. He stood steady, like someone who had nothing left to prove. "Here you go, sir," the teller said, softer this time. "All set." Walter nodded. "Appreciate it." She looked like she wanted to say something else, maybe even apologize, but nothing came out. So he tucked the cash into his wallet, folded the check stub carefully, and turned to Langston. "I can't believe it's you," he said, half grinning. "You look more important." Langston laughed. "It's the tie. Makes me look like I know what I'm doing." Walter smirked. Still talk like a guy who used to sleep in the back of his own jeep. I never could sleep on the ground, Langston said. You used to make fun of me for that. Walter's eyes brightened for a moment. Yeah, I did. Behind them, the manager straightened his tie and cleared his throat. I'd like to offer a formal apology on behalf of the bank. We weren't aware of Mr. Jenkins' history. Otherwise, we might have... Langston cut him off. Don't finish that sentence. The manager froze. See, that's the problem. Langston continued. You think respect has to be earned with credentials or history. What about decency? You had a man here, elderly, polite, and just trying to cash a check, and you turned him into a complication. The manager's face flushed. Langston took a step closer. Not aggressive, just firm. If he hadn't worn that hat, you'd still be ignoring him. If I hadn't walked in, he'd have left with nothing. That should bother you more than it does. I understand, the manager said quickly. We'll review our procedures. Langston turned back to Walter. Come on, let's get out of here. As they headed toward the doors, a teenage boy in the corner lowered his headphones and looked up. Sir, he called out. Walter stopped. Were you really in the war? The boy asked. Walter turned around. I was. Vietnam? The kid said. Yeah, Walter replied. Mechanic. Got stuck with a lot of busted engines and busted people. The boy stood up. That's cool. Walter tilted his head. Wasn't really cool at the time, but thanks. The kid gave him a small nod. It wasn't performative. It wasn't forced, just real. Outside, the afternoon sun hit harder than before. Walter blinked in the light, adjusting his cap. Langston held the door open, then followed him onto the sidewalk. The city moved on around them. Cars passed, horns honked. A pair of joggers zipped by, lost in their own world. But for a moment, the air between the two men was still. You didn't have to do that, Walter said, stuffing the folded bills deeper into his coat pocket. Could have let me walk, Langston replied without looking at him. And you would have, Walter shrugged. I've had worse days. Doesn't mean you deserved one today. They walked slowly together along the sidewalk. Two men from another time, out of place in a world that had changed too quickly. But maybe, just maybe, that moment inside the bank had shifted something. A few people had watched. Maybe they'd remember it. Langston took a breath. You doing all right, otherwise? Still in that little apartment off Franklin Boulevard? Still there, Walter said. Same squeaky stairs, same neighbor who plays saxophone badly every night? Langston smiled. Sounds peaceful? Walter gave a short laugh. That's one word for it. But peace isn't always about quiet. It's about being seen. And for the first time in a long time, Walter felt like someone actually saw him again. The two men kept walking until they reached the bench across from the old record store, the kind of place that had long since stopped selling anything but memories. Walter sank into the bench with a slow exhale, adjusting his grip on the cane before resting it between his knees. Langston remained standing for a moment, scanning the street, before finally sitting beside him. They sat in silence. Then Walter broke it. I wasn't even mad, you know, he said quietly. Not really. Langston turned. No? No, Walter said. I've been turned down for more important things than a check. Housing stuff. Benefits. Hell, I once got denied a flu shot because the guy said I didn't look like a priority. Said I could wait. Langston shook his head. That's the part that gets under my skin. Not just what they did, but how easy it was for them to do it. Walter looked at him. You know what bothers me? What? I didn't even expect better. Langston didn't answer at first. The honesty in Walter's voice stung more than the incident itself. He had command experience, years of seeing how systems either lifted men up or spit them out. Walter wasn't bitter. He was used to it. That was worse. I should have raised hell, Walter added. Years ago. But you get tired, and you tell yourself it's not worth the noise. It is, Langston said. It always is. Walter nodded, eyes distant. Still not used to being called sir anymore. You earned it, Langston replied. And you didn't have to step in. But you did. Langston leaned forward slightly. Let me tell you something. When I came back home in '73, I walked into a diner wearing my uniform. The hostess looked me up and down and said they didn't serve people like me, like I was some kind of shame to look at. Walter raised his eyebrows. Langston went on. I kept walking. Sat down anyway. Some guy threw a sugar packet at me from across the room. Didn't even look my way. Just did it. Like I wasn't even human. Walter was quiet for a long second. I guess we all carried something home. Yeah, Langston said. But no one sees it unless we show them. A breeze passed, carrying the smell of baked asphalt and fried food from the deli down the block. Cars cruised slowly through the late afternoon sun. In the window of the record shop, a small TV played black and white clips of old jazz concerts. The sound was too faint to make out, but the trumpeter's cheeks puffed with conviction. Walter leaned back, closing his eyes. You know, when I was over there, I used to tell myself that one day, when I was old, I'd get to sit on a porch with a cold beer and nobody would ever question if I belonged there. Langston didn't interrupt. I pictured grandkids running around. Walter continued. Laughter, barbecue smoke in the air. That whole picture people have in their heads. You don't have grandkids? Langston asked gently. Walter shook his head. Only one daughter. She's good to me, though. Calls often. But life got away from her. Got away from me, too. Langston looked at him. That check today. Was that all you had? Walter hesitated, then nodded. For now. Langston sighed, pressing his palms together. You should never have to scrape for basic things. I know pride's a thing, but there are ways to get help. Real help. Walter waved him off gently. I know, but it's not just about money. It's about how it feels walking in a place like that and knowing you're just a problem to solve. An inconvenience. Langston's tone dropped lower. They'll remember today. I made sure of that. Walter turned to him with a small, sideways grin. Oh, I think you scared the hell out of that manager. Langston chuckled. Good. He needed it. They shared a laugh. Not loud, but real. A laugh pulled from someplace deeper than the moment. But before they left that bench, Langston had one more thing to ask. A question that would change what came next. Langston looked over at Walter again, studying him quietly before speaking. You ever thought about telling your story? He asked. Walter tilted his head. Telling it to who? To anyone who needs to hear it. Walter huffed. Most folks don't want to hear it. They say they do, but they're really just waiting for you to wrap it up so they can talk about gas prices or their phone bill. Langston shook his head. I don't mean casual small talk. I'm talking about real stories. What it took to survive. What it felt like to come home to a country that barely remembered you. Walter raised an eyebrow. You trying to get me on a stage? Langston didn't smile this time. I'm inviting you to a Veterans Roundtable next Thursday at the Elk Grove Community Center. It's not a show. It's 10 or 15 of us who talk, listen, argue sometimes. But we don't let anyone feel like they're shouting into a hole. Walter leaned back on the bench. I haven't been around other vets in a long time. That's why I'm asking. Walter looked down at his hands. They were calloused, but still steady. His right thumb had a scar from a broken socket wrench. His knuckles were bony now, the skin thinner. But he remembered a time when those same hands could lift an engine block without a second thought. He looked back at Langston. What would I even say? Langston shrugged. Tell them about that truck in Long Bin, or about the time you made a working radio out of a busted fan and a matchbox. You don't have to be polished. You just have to be honest. Walter laughed under his breath. You remember that thing? The fan radio? Of course I remember. I yelled at you because I thought you were wasting time. Then it picked up a signal from Saigon and saved us from driving into a trap. Walter rubbed his chin. That was a weird day. Loud. Smelled like copper and cordite. They were quiet again. But this time the silence was easier. Langston reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Walter. Flyer for the event. My number's on the back. If you come, great. If not, well, I'll probably keep bugging you anyway. Walter looked at the flyer. The font was too small, and the design was clearly made by someone in their 20s trying to appeal to people in their 70s. It had a bald eagle and an American flag faded in the background, and at the top it read, "Veterans Talking, Real Stories, Real Brotherhood." He slipped the paper into his coat pocket. "I'll think about it." Langston nodded. "That's all I ask." They sat there a bit longer, letting the moment settle. The street around them kept moving. A city bus hissed as it pulled to a stop. Someone across the street dropped a coffee cup, and it rolled into the gutter. Life didn't pause just because two old soldiers were catching up, but for those few minutes, it felt like time gave them a little space. Then Walter said something unexpected. "You know, I didn't save that convoy for recognition. I didn't think about medals or stories. I just knew if I didn't fix that truck, men would die. That was it. That simple." Langston looked at him. "I know. But this thing today," Walter continued, "this little moment in a bank, it reminded me that silence lets people forget. If you never speak up, they'll never know what you've seen, or what you've done, and maybe they'll keep treating every old man with a cane like he's already halfway gone." Langston didn't say anything. He just nodded once. Walter adjusted his cap, then added, "You weren't just speaking for me in there. You were speaking for all the ones who didn't make it back to stand in line. And for the ones who did, but don't have the strength to speak anymore." Langston's jaw clenched, not in anger, but in recognition. "Maybe," Walter said slowly. "I will come next Thursday." Langston gave him a look, not one of praise, just quiet affirmation. "Good," he said. "We need your voice." But before they parted ways, there was one more moment of reckoning, something waiting just around the corner that neither of them expected. Back at the bank, things hadn't quite settled. Inside the manager's office, the door now shut, a call was already in progress. The branch manager, whose nameplate read Jordan Reeve, stood stiffly behind his desk, holding the receiver like it might bite him. On the other end of the line was the bank's regional director, Angela McCoy, who'd spent the last 15 minutes getting a rundown of what had happened from another employee who texted her mid-incident. "No, I'm not asking." Angela's voice rang clear. "I'm telling you, you call that man, you apologize, and you get ahead of this before it spreads. That man has a name." "Walter Jenkins," Jordan replied, his voice tight. "And the man who intervened?" Jordan swallowed. "General Robert Langston. Retired. U.S. Army." There was a long pause. "Jesus, Jordan," Angela muttered. "You just turned away a war veteran with expired ID and doubled down when a general vouched for him. That's not just a PR risk. That's a reflection of judgment." "I didn't know who he was," Jordan said quickly. "You shouldn't have needed to," Angela snapped. "You had an elderly man trying to cash a check with a VA card. That should have been enough for you to stop and think." Jordan shifted in place, still holding the phone. "So, what do you want me to do now?" Angela didn't miss a beat. "First, you call him. Offer a formal apology. Second, send a handwritten letter, something he can hold, not some generic form. Third, I want you and your staff scheduled for a sensitivity and customer experience workshop next week." Jordan sighed. "We've already done the annual compliance." "I said next week," she cut in. He didn't argue again. Angela continued. "And for what it's worth, I'll be reaching out to Mr. Jenkins myself. If we can't do better than this, we don't deserve to call ourselves a community bank." As the call ended, Jordan leaned back, pressing his palms into his desk. Sweat was beading under his collar. He'd been managing branches for almost 10 years, and not once had he found himself at the center of a situation like this. The worst part wasn't the mistake. It was how easily he'd made it. Meanwhile, outside the bank, Walter and Langston had just started to part ways when Walter's flip phone buzzed weakly in his pocket. He stopped, pulling it out slowly and squinting at the unfamiliar number on the screen. He answered with a cautious, "Hello?" "Mr. Jenkins?" came a woman's voice. "This is Angela McCoy, Regional Director with First Pacific. I'm calling personally to apologize for what happened to you today at our J Street branch." Walter looked at Langston, who raised an eyebrow. Angela continued. "I understand you were denied service despite presenting a VA card and being a long-time customer. That should not have happened. We're taking the matter seriously, and I want to assure you corrective action is already underway." Walter stayed quiet for a second. Then he said, "I'm not mad. Just tired. That's all. I completely understand." Angela replied, "But tired or not, you deserve to be treated with dignity. We failed to do that today." Walter let out a small breath. "Thank you for the call." "There'll also be a letter sent to your home," Angela added. "And, if you're comfortable, I'd like to invite you to speak briefly at our next Community Advisory Board meeting. It's just an idea, but hearing from someone like you might change how our staff sees situations beyond policy." Walter chuckled. "I'm getting real popular today." Angela smiled on the other end. "You're already someone worth hearing from, Mr. Jenkins. We just failed to listen in time." They hung up. Langston gave him a look. "She grovel?" Walter grinned. "Just enough." Langston laughed. "Good. It's a start." Walter pocketed the phone. "Never thought I'd see the day when I'd get invited to speak anywhere outside of a waiting room." "You've still got a lot to say," Langston said. "And people who need to hear it." They began walking again, heading toward the bus stop. But what neither of them realized just yet was that this story, this small clash in a small branch, had already started to spread far beyond those walls. The bench across from the bank had emptied, and the sun had started its slow descent behind the rooftops. Walter and Langston stood at the corner, just a few steps from the bus stop. The city hadn't paused, but something about the air felt different now. People passed without knowing what had just happened inside that building, but a few who'd witnessed it lingered on the sidewalk, caught between wanting to speak and fearing it would come out wrong. One of them, a young woman with a messenger bag and faded UCLA hoodie, approached carefully. She looked no older than 30. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice uncertain. "I was in the line earlier. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Walter turned to her slowly. "Sorry for what?" "For not saying something," she replied. "For watching and not doing anything. It didn't feel right, but I just stood there. I shouldn't have." Walter studied her face. "She meant it. You didn't have to speak," he said gently. "Most people don't. That's just the way it's always been." "But it shouldn't be," she insisted. "I mean, you were disrespected, and everyone saw it. We just let it happen like it was nothing." Langston stepped in. "You're saying something now. That counts." The woman nodded, glancing at Walter again. "Thank you for what you did. Back then, and today." Walter gave her a half smile. "Just fixed trucks, ma'am. That's all I did." "No," she said. "You stood tall when people sat down." She turned and walked away, leaving the two men in silence again. Moments later, another voice called out, this time from an older man across the street, wearing a delivery uniform. He jogged over, breathing a little heavy. "Hey, sir, I just, wanted to shake your hand," he said, extending it to Walter. Walter looked at it for a second, then reached out and took it. "I did a couple tours myself. Nothing big, just logistics in Kuwait. But it means a lot, seeing someone stand up for us. I saw what happened from the sidewalk. Respect." Walter nodded, saying little, but the man's face said he didn't need a speech. He gave a short salute, then hurried off to his van. Langston turned to Walter. "You seeing a pattern?" Walter exhaled through his nose. "I'm seeing people realizing they had eyes the whole time." They started walking again. The sidewalk was cracked in places, patched and repatched by years of temporary fixes, like most things these days. A passing car honked once, not aggressively, just a brief acknowledgement. Someone inside gave a thumbs up out the window. Walter didn't react. Not because he didn't appreciate it, but because he wasn't used to being noticed for something other than his limp. As they neared the crosswalk, Langston slowed his steps. "Let me ask you something." "All right," Walter said. "Do you think if I hadn't walked in, anyone would have stepped in for you?" Walter didn't answer right away. "I don't think so," he said finally. "Not because people are mean, just because they're scared. Scared to get involved, scared to be wrong. Scared to look stupid," Langston nodded, "and scared of their own comfort being disrupted." "Exactly." The traffic light turned red, and they crossed together. "Maybe," Walter continued. "All it takes is one moment like that to make someone less scared the next time. That girl, the delivery guy, they won't stay quiet again." Langston looked over. You think you changed them? Walter shook his head. Nah, I think they changed themselves. I just gave them a reason to. A bus pulled up with a groan, brakes squealing as the doors opened. Walter turned to Langston. This is me. Langston extended his hand. Call me before Thursday. Walter smiled. I will. And if I don't, come find me anyway. Langston smirked. You know I will. Walter climbed the steps slowly, waving once before finding a seat near the front. As the bus pulled away, Langston stood on the sidewalk, watching until it disappeared around the corner. The street returned to its rhythm, but something had shifted. Something small, but lasting. But the biggest change was yet to come, and it wasn't going to be quiet. 3 days passed. Walter hadn't planned on going anywhere. He'd set the flyer Langston gave him on the counter by his microwave, next to a stack of unopened mail and a grocery list he hadn't finished. But every time he walked past it, something in him stopped. Not quite guilt, not pressure, something quieter, something like purpose. On the 4th day, he took the flyer with him on the bus to the corner diner. He didn't eat there much, prices were creeping up, but the waitress knew his name, and the eggs came with 2 free refills of black coffee. He took his usual booth, pulled out the flyer, and stared at it between bites of toast. That's when the man in the next booth leaned over and said, You the guy from the bank video? Walter looked up, fork halfway to his mouth. What video? The man held up his phone and tilted it. There it was. Grainy footage from someone's cell phone showing Walter at the counter, Langston stepping in. And the moment the room went silent. The title underneath said, Old Vet Denied at Bank. Then this man walked in. It had over 200,000 views. Walter set his fork down. I've seen that 5 times. The man said. You handled it real respectful. Not like most folks would have. Walter didn't answer right away. Didn't know anyone was recording? The man laughed. Some kid posted it on TikTok. Said it changed how he sees his own grandfather. Walter shook his head slowly. Wasn't looking to be on the internet. Maybe you weren't. The man said. But maybe folks needed to see it. By the time Walter got home, he had 3 missed calls. One from Langston, one from a woman at a local news station, and one from someone with a southern accent asking if he'd be interested in speaking at a high school assembly. He sat on the edge of his bed and listened to the voicemails, one by one. After the last one, he picked up the flyer from the table. Maybe it wasn't about one check. Or one bank. Maybe the real problem was how many people this happened to every day, and how few had someone like Langston walk in behind them. Later that evening, Walter called Langston back. You see that video? Walter asked as soon as he heard the general's voice. Langston chuckled. Yeah, I've been on the phone all day about it. Some city rep wants to invite us to a roundtable on senior treatment in public services. Walter sighed. I didn't ask for this. No, Langston said. But maybe you were supposed to be the one who finally said something, even if it was just by standing there. Walter was quiet. You think this changes anything? Depends, Langston replied. If people talk about it for a week and move on, probably not. But if you show up next Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and keep showing them what quiet dignity looks like, then maybe it does. Walter didn't respond right away. Then he said, I'll be there. The next Thursday, Walter showed up wearing the same cap, the same jeans. He stood at the front of a small room with mismatched chairs and old flags on the wall. About 20 people were there, some vets, some teens, a few city employees who looked like they came out of obligation. Langston introduced him. This man didn't ask to speak today, but the way he was treated sparked something bigger than any of us expected. Walter cleared his throat, walking to the front slowly. I'm not good at speeches, he said. I fix things. That's always been my thing. You hand me something broken, I try to make it run again. He paused. But you can't fix people. Not the same way. You can't just swap out a part and expect them to run right. What you can do is see them. Treat them like they matter. Not because of what they used to do, but because they're still here. A few heads nodded. No phones out. Just eyes. And maybe next time someone like me walks into a room. Walter added, You don't wait for someone with stars on their shoulder to speak first. But even as Walter spoke those words, he didn't yet realize just how far they'd carry, or who would be listening next. The following week, a letter arrived in Walter's mailbox with an unfamiliar return address. He opened it slowly, the paper stiff and formal. It was from a senator's office, someone he'd never heard of, but the message was personal. It thanked him, not just for his service, but for his recent words at the veterans gathering. Someone had recorded his short talk and passed it along. Now, that clip was being used in an internal staff training session for government employees across the state. Walter stared at the letter, unmoving. His name had never been printed on government letterhead for anything other than tax records. He folded the paper neatly and set it down on the kitchen table. A knock came at his door just a few minutes later. It was Langston. "Didn't think I'd find you home," the general said with a smile, holding 2 coffees. "Thought you might have gone viral again." Walter grunted. "Already had one stranger recognize me at the grocery store. She asked for a selfie." Langston laughed, handing him a cup. "Get used to it." They sat on the small balcony of Walter's apartment. The sky was soft and orange, city sounds humming far below. The balcony railing was rusted in places. Walter had fixed it 3 times. "I never wanted attention," Walter said after a long pause. Langston nodded. "You didn't ask for it. You earned it." Walter looked over. "You know, for a long time, I thought the world just moved on, left people like me behind." Langston swirled the coffee in his cup. "Sometimes it does. But then a moment like that one in the bank reminds people we're still here, still watching, still worth listening to." They sat in silence for a few more minutes. Comfortable now, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. "I've been thinking," Walter said. "Maybe I do keep showing up. That group we talked to, that wasn't just talk. Some of those folks left with something they didn't have when they walked in." Langston sipped his coffee. "That's how change starts." Walter looked out toward the street. A bus passed slowly, its headlights blinking in rhythm. He thought of the teller, of the manager, of the people in line who looked away. Maybe some of them told the story later. Maybe some pretended it never happened. But a few, he was sure now, had seen something worth remembering. "You think people really change?" Walter asked suddenly. Langston thought a second. "Not all at once, but sometimes you witness something you can't unsee. And from that point on, you don't walk the same way anymore." Walter leaned back in his chair. "I like that." "You should," Langston said. "You caused it." They clinked coffee cups gently, not like a toast, just acknowledgement. As the light faded, a breeze cut across the balcony. Walter looked at the faded flag pinned above his window, corners curled from age. He didn't feel like a symbol. He didn't want to be one. He was just a man trying to be treated like he mattered. And somehow that had turned into more than enough. He turned to Langston one last time. "Next Thursday, same place?" Langston nodded. "I'll pick you up. You're part of the program now." Walter smiled. "Guess I better clean my boots." The general stood. "Keep them dusty. That's how we know they've walked through something." Walter sat there long after Langston left, long enough for the streetlights to flicker on and the world to quiet down. He didn't feel young again. He didn't feel powerful. He just felt seen. And for the first time in years, that was enough. Some lessons don't come in speeches or books. They come in how we treat each other when no one's keeping score. Respect isn't earned by medals or age. It's earned by remembering that everyone's story matters. And maybe next time you see someone standing quietly at the back of the line, you'll ask yourself, who's really invisible? And who's just waiting for someone to notice? If this story meant something to you, share it, talk about it, pass it on. And don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that remind us what it means to see each other clearly.